Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. So, before we get started on the meat of this video, I just want to let you know the opening of this video may be a little bit weird transitionally because this is actually a discussion that I had coming off of the back of my thoughts of Star Trek Picard Season 3, Episode 9 that I just reviewed, and my review just went up at the same time that this video went up. So I was sort of like getting into a larger discussion about how I view the Borg, especially within the context of this season of Star Trek Picard, and how I found some of its elements to be concerning to me. And I wanted to offer up my criticism. But the rant sort of became its own whole thing, and almost as long as the review itself, so I kind of wanted to separate it out and sort of and have it be its own standalone video. So this is that discussion, so just know if the opening of this video is a little bit strange, that's the reason. But there will be full spoilers for Star Trek Picard Season 3, Episode 9 in this video. So just know that going into this, and if you want my review, go check that out, but I do think this is an important discussion. I want to talk about why I think using the Borg in the way that they do in this episode is a problem, especially from my perspective and who I am. And I know a few of you might start listening to this and might even balk at some of my perspectives on this, which is totally fair. We're all allowed to have opinions here, and I want to always be clear that I am offering you my opinion and my discussion, not my take and saying, like, this is the end of it. But I do want to express my concern. So please, if you want to hear me out, stick all the way through this, because I think that this is an important concern to express about this and thinking about this metaphor of the Borg in this context. So here's my issue with the way the Borg and the Queen are depicted here. Many people for a long time have generally disliked the Borg Queen in Star Trek because it makes the Borg have a kind of centralized villain. The Queen makes the threat less this immense and unknowable alien entity, like an eldritch horror thing, and has reduced the Borg to a kind of like scary monster woman with the ability to make people her own personal like RC car units. And the original way that the Borg were written is maybe they'll assimilate you, maybe not, who knows. A sort of like eldritch unknowable horror, these sort of like natural disasters that you can't do anything but like get out of the way of.
It's not safe out here. It's wondrous, with treasures to satiate desires both subtle and gross. But it's not for the timid.
And so when you bring the Queen into it, it changes that metaphor in a very significant way. Now, this is an issue that has happened with the Queen since she first appeared all the way back in First Contact and then all the way into Star Trek Voyager. And it does change what the Borg mean in some way. But if you are to reckon with the fact that the Queen is part of the Borg, I don't mind if she's used, and I actually think she'd be a very potent metaphor if she's used in a very particular way. With the Queen in mind, when we think about the Borg, we must then consider then what she stands for in her version of what the Borg are. Many people hear the term collective and think, okay, the Borg must stand in for communism. But in actuality, the Federation is more communistic as a society, mixed in with a representational democracy. They share resources, no one can accumulate wealth. It's all built on these ideas of community and shared value, and it's got like a communist vibe, let's just say, if not necessarily like explicitly communist. Certainly, at the very least, a socialist one. So, in contrast then, what does this make the Borg when we have the Borg Queen? Well, what it makes the Borg and what makes the appeal of the Borg so potent is a fascistic appeal. Jack even says this, like, quite literally in this episode. He literally calls the Borg cybernetic authoritarianism. Like, that literally a quote said in this episode. And the appeal of fascism, and I want to be clear, fascism's awful, but the appeal of fascism to people is that it tricks you into giving up your individuality for the whole, because it makes you believe that you should fit in to a role for the larger system, for the larger collective, rather than society being the thing that enables you to find your own role for yourself, like the Federation does. It tells you be a drone for the larger state collective and our desire for endless consumption, growth, and war, and death, and assimilation in pursuit of that larger goal. The larger goal being perfection, something the Borg Queen constantly states going all the way back to her first appearance in First Contact.
But we evolved to include the synthetic. Now we use both to attain perfection. Your goal should be the same as ours.
For example, if we're talking about like Nazis' versions of fascism, their perfection was an Aryan ideal, and they wanted to assimilate the entirety of Earth by expanding German territory. So this kind of fits and maps on to a very clear Borg mentality. But the appeal for individuals within that fascist system is that an individual theoretically could find comfort in feeling that they are taking part in something bigger, a grander design. Never mind that no one person can ever really fit that role, because that role is meant to suck you dry and also put you at odds with everyone else and isolate you from everyone else to sort of feed this endless desire for, violence, war, and death, and doesn't really care for you as a person. Again, as we see the Borg often doing, like the Borg are often seen as isolated and alone, and they just lose their individuality to the whole, rather than getting to exist as their own selves. But it can be comforting and appealing to feel like you have a purpose for a larger grand design, even if that purpose is for the state, not yourself. And I recommend reading Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist by Felix Guattari, which is, I think, a great sort of text that sort of dives into why some people want to fall into fascism, or why there is an appeal to it. Now, what this does not mean is that the Borg always have to be a one-for-one with fascism in any given episode or work, that it's supposed to be like a big fascism metaphor, as fascism comes more out of semiotics and signs, and can actually spring up is a more of a dynamic, wherever there's this sort of dynamic appeal that feeds a fascistic mindset that is layered into institutional thinking, or systemic thinking. This metaphor and it means that the Borg metaphor can work in like a lot of ways. For example, it can be a cult with the Queen as a cult leader, or a government with the Queen as a totalitarian figure, or a corporation with the Queen as a CEO. The Queen is the leader that everyone serves as a drone for, like workers serving as CEO, or the citizenry like serving an emperor or an authoritarian in a totalitarian government, or cultists sort of following a cult leader. Just sort of all in service of that figure, that sort of authoritarian, rather than an individual. But when we take that metaphor and place it within a queer context, now I'll come back to why I'm going to do that in just a minute, but when we place that in a queer context, the Borg represent a heteronormative society, one that tells you that you must not be queer, but instead be straight. Don't be transgender. Be your assigned gender, and then sort of serve the sort of function of society. Marry and have your 2.5 kids for the heteronormative world. What this then does, again, extending the queer reading, and I will come back to why I think this is pertinent to this season, is this makes the X-Borg, like we saw in Season 1 of Star Trek Picard with the character of Hugh, or just Seven of Nine and Picard generally in every appearance that they've had, is that they are people who have released themselves and sort of freed themselves from the expectations of a cisnormative society and try to be their full selves, to become full individual people outside of the sort of expectations of serving the larger state. It sort of represents like queer people coming out. Like coming out of the closet. And these queer folks who come out of the closet will then face stigma from a society that will allow them to exist, but not really fully accept them, but just sort of want to use them as like a worker force, and we'll accept you, but we'll still oppress you. As we saw very clearly with the Romulans in Season 1 of Star Trek Picard oppressing the X-Borg there.
The outcomes are far from ideal.
What you're doing is good, Hugh. There's no need for it to be perfect. After all these years, you're showing what the Borg are underneath. They're victims, not monsters.
Still, we remain the most hated people in the galaxy. Just as helpless and enslaved as before. Only now, our queen is a Romulan.
The Federation, then, with that, is a place where we have the ideal version of how we have queer people sort of integrated into society. Queerness is not only not stigmatized, but accepted into society as part of the grander tapestry of humanity. It's recognizing queerness as not only acceptable, but beautiful. Not more beautiful, but just as beautiful as being straight is beautiful, for example. It's sort of like no stigmas, but no aggrandizement, just sort of like you are part of this, and we recognize you getting to fulfill your own full desires and potential. That's what the Federation represents, ideally. And again, the Federation is not, a utopia, but it strives for utopia, and those are the ideals that the Federation would strive for when it comes to a queer reading. Though I will say, if we're talking about XBs, one issue that the XBs do face in terms of how they've been represented, particularly in Season 1 of Star Trek Picard, is how they're often viewed solely as victims, as well as people who could only be used by the plot in ways that is pitying yet ultimately dehumanizing of them. Not full people who found community and identity in their being a dispersed people and finding like a queer found family or an XB found family, for example, but are sort of like just victims and someone to pity. We saw that very clearly in Season 1 of Star Trek Picard with like how the Romulans sort of like literally murdered a bunch of the X-Borg. We never really get a sense of like what the X-Borg community is. We just sort of like hear they're victims.
Now.
And I would actually say that Star Trek Voyager in the episode Unity, I think in Season 3, actually nails a dispersed X-Borg found family community much better, though that episode still has its own issues.
People started looking around and found they were living among other cultures they didn't understand. Or worse, species they'd been taught to hate. Everything I told you about forming a cooperative, building a new society, I meant it.
Riley's telling the truth, Commander Chakotay. Look at me. I was Romulan. I was taught to hate humans, the Federation. But Riley and I are friends now. I'm part of the cooperative.
Okay, so all of that is the basics of what I'm getting to here. It can be more complicated than that. We can go into like nuance of different Borg depictions throughout all the decades, but it's sort of the groundwork for my issues with Star Trek Picard here. Because I bet a lot of you are sort of listening to all this rant and you're like, Jesse, okay, I get you can read a queer metaphor onto the Borg, but as you said, the queer metaphor is not necessarily always the one that you can apply to the Borg. So why are you using it here for Star Trek Picard? Do you think it even is pertinent to what's going on here with Star Trek Picard? And I will say very much yes. And we actually have a very clear basis for why in this season with the character of Seven of Nine. Seven of Nine has repeatedly this season, just this season, been used as a transgender metaphor, which Terry Matalas, the showrunner of Star Trek Picard, mentioned was intentional.
So, how'd you know?
Ensign LaForge always calls me Commander 7. Out of respect.
Good call.
And Shaw is someone who is shown to have a stigma against X-Borg, like we saw with him towards Picard in Episode 1 and also Episode 4.
11,000 dead. Do you know where your old man was on that day? He was on that Borg cube, setting the world on fire!
And actually, that really works when you think about it when it comes to the relationship between Shaw and X-Borg and specifically Seven, because Shaw has been shown to be an asshole, but someone working on trying to get over it. Like, the show is critical of him and doesn't forgive him for his bigotry towards Seven, yet it also is empathetic towards him struggling with that stigma. He is someone who hates the Borg because it was a society that traumatized him and wanted to try to make him a drone and killed people around him for its endless fueling of destruction. But he has then sublimated that anger not onto the Borg, but onto XBs around him. He sort of created a scapegoat with them and put it onto that anger onto Seven and Picard, whom he doesn't really understand or see as just as much victims, or if not more so victims of the Borg than he is.
The only Borg so deadly. They gave him a goddamn name.
All right, that's enough.
No.
Just as, again, applying to a queer reading, as trans people ourselves are also more visible and direct victims of a cisnormative society, but we're also the ones that are visible sort of refutations of it, and so people will sort of, push back against trans people and get angry at trans people for not conforming to an ideal version of what we're supposed to be, our assigned gender at birth. But everyone suffers under the Borg, under this system. So when Shaw dies in this episode, and he accepts Seven by saying her name, her true name, it shows him finally coming to see and accept others beyond his prejudice and scapegoating, realizing what the real enemy is, which is the Borg, and dying while representing a true ideal of Starfleet and the Federation. A person both in act and thought who's sort of living up to that utopian ideal of the Federation. And for me, Shaw is perfectly written in that aspect, and my favorite part of this season of the show, to be very honest. We also have in episode 6 of this episode, with Seven saying, "The Voyager was my collective."
I was reborn there. She was my home. Her crew were my family. And now
You're just trying to find another. We all long for connection. We're all just a little bit alone, aren't we?
To reframe the Voyager crew as her queer found family. So in this season already, queerness becomes a valid reading of the Borg. And given the later revelations around Jack and his Borg history, him connecting to Seven over this also showcases Jack's desire to create a queer found family with Seven, something that he expresses he wants to do, to form a collective in episode 9 of Star Trek Picard.
Stars in the same galaxy, but light years between us.
Oh, you are definitely your father's son. He too has a knack for the poetic drive-by observation. It can be very annoying, but it can also make a person feel seen.
But this is not just isolated to Seven, though, or not even just this season of Picard, because you can find readings that match this with the Borg a ton throughout the entire series. Hell, even just last year, Prodigy did a very similar story with the character of Zero, the non-binary character on that show, where they broke free of the Borg collective and said that the Protostar crew, the Starfleet-like crew, was actually their collective, was actually their found family.
I will resist, because I'm already a part of a collective that is stronger than you will ever be! Are you all right? We must hurry. I lured them into a dormant state, but it won't hold for long.
Hero's back! I thought we lost you.
I've already found my collective.
And that episode, I think, perfectly nails this queer allegory. So again, you're probably asking, why does this matter? Well, when we look at Jack and Picard, if we put a queer reading onto this, we could read it as Jack is a young man struggling with being gay, even being a self-hating gay person for not understanding the queer part of himself, for like knowing that it's there but not being able to express it.
I've always felt different. Like there's something wrong with me.
And then he comes out to his dad, and when he comes out, he wants his dad to accept him, and Picard doesn't, because Picard himself seems to be struggling with his own internal trauma and stigma towards his experience with the Borg, with his experience with, again, sort of a queer reading. And this is where this gets complicated and where it starts to become a problem if you're not already seeing the issue here, because Picard's relationship to the Borg is one of trauma, and one where he was coerced into experiencing the Borg against his will, against his consent. And that'll come back and be very important in just a minute.
I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't good enough. I should have been able to stop them. I should.
But continuing on this sort of parent-child relationship, Jack doesn't get the acceptance that he wants from his father, and so he rebels against his dad angrily, and feeling alone and isolated, turn towards this fascistic ideal to feel part of something greater. And all of that fits the fascism metaphor. That's how fascism draws people in, by generating isolation and anger and causing them to lash out, the scapegoats that fascism sort of is directing them towards. But this is where we come to the issue, because if this is how the framing and metaphor works, this frames the Borg not as the unaccepting society, the sort of cisnormative values of society, but it frames the Borg as the gay community itself. In this reading, what it necessarily means is that becoming a full Borg, being assimilated by the Borg, is equivalent to being fully out and gay. And I have a problem with that, because this frames the gay community as the Borg, as the fascist metaphor, as the ones who assimilate, who coerce people into joining them, and try to turn people into them. I mean, assimilation is often quite literally equated to sex, as we saw with Data in First Contact.
Are you familiar with physical forms of pleasure?
If you are referring to sexuality, I am fully functional.
And that is a really problematic element for me, because it's that exact line of stigma that queer people are facing today. Our bodies are often sexualized, like us existing in spaces are already seen as tantamount to a fetish or a sex thing, and we're seen as coercive. Oh, you're a gay man trying to turn people gay, trying to trick little boys into having sex with you, or, you know, there's a gay gene that you can pass on like Borg sperm, or you're transing the children, which is a very pertinent discussion right now, if you're sort of looking at a lot of the anti-trans rhetoric that we're seeing today. And so I worry about this misunderstandings of the implications of the metaphor of the Borg in this episode when it relates to Jack and Picard, especially as we go into the next episode. Like, quite literally, the episode ends with the Borg Queen turning all of the kids into Borg. Like, transing and queering all the children. In my opinion, if we consider the Borg in that context, which I, again, think is precedented, not only throughout all of Star Trek, but within this season specifically, in terms of a lot of how this has been played, in terms of the interaction between Seven and Shaw, but also Jack and Picard, to me, it's important to make sure that you get that metaphor right and target it where it needs to be targeted. Otherwise, it plays into very unfortunate biases around the queer community. My biggest worry is if we go into next episode, and at the end of the season, Jack is somehow cured of being Borg. Or even if he isn't cured of his Borgness, it's something that he'll be ashamed of instead of being accepted for. And that would really implicate an idea of this being self-hating, despite simply being born that way, or your society or your parents not accepting you for who you are because of their own feelings about you, not your own terms. And it would read very much like, kind of like a gay conversion therapy, honestly, which I would be very disturbed by. This is clearly not the intentions of the writers. I want to be upfront about that. Like, I'm not sitting here saying, like, this is what the writers are trying to get at. I think it's more that it's a not fully following through on the implications of, we want to use Seven this way, we want to have this dynamic between Jack and Picard, but then also place it within this framework of, like, the Borg being the villain. And how that relates to the context of which this show is airing in today. And I bring this up not to hate on anybody or to hate on the writers, but to point out the perspective. You know, I have no issue with Terry Matalas. I think he's a solid writer. I've certainly enjoyed a lot of this season and a lot of the choices that were made. But he's also a cis straight dude, and that's not a problem. I want to be very clear, because I know people even saying that would be like, oh, Jessie, you're hating on men or whatever. Not what I'm saying here. What I am saying is that is a perspective. And it dovetails with another issue that I'm seeing in reaction to this season of Star Trek Picard, because there's this sort of ongoing narrative on Twitter happening right now and in other places in terms of the discourse around Star Trek Picard, and it's this rhetoric that makes me uncomfortable about this being a return to real Star Trek. Like, Star Trek Picard Season 3 is a return to form for Star Trek, which seems to forget that there's been a lot of good Star Trek lately, like Star Trek Prodigy, Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Star Trek Discovery. Even if we were to like discount Discovery, which I don't think we should because I love Discovery for a lot of reasons, but that was a show that I think there have been both legitimate and non-legitimate, or more toxic, I guess I should say, criticisms of Discovery. But Strange New Worlds was well received, generally by everybody. Prodigy was. So was Lower Decks, you know. And Picard seasons 1 and 2 were not. But I feel like, to a degree, part of the reason that this narrative has formed is, in part, I think it's because Picard is the biggest show. You know, it has Patrick Stewart in it. More people are going to watch it, so they may not have watched the other shows. So I think that that's part of why this rhetoric is like, maybe they've only seen the first 2 seasons of Picard, and it's like, oh, this season is radically different. We like what this is and not those seasons. But also, I think even beyond that, there, especially within certain spaces within the Trekkie fandom, this is the show that I think most returns, or at least this season has been the one that most returns to that TNG, Rick Berman, 80s, 90s, early 2000s style of Star Trek storytelling. And I want to be clear, I love that era of Star Trek. Obviously. Look at everything about me. But the problem, and this is a problem that I kind of like, I've been talking about in my Sex and Star Trek series over on my main channel with my bigger video essays, and something I'm writing about with my Sex and Star Trek Deep Space Nine video that I'm working on right now. Like, there's a pile of books right over here that's my research for that. But the problem with that era of Star Trek is that it often centered cis, straight, male viewpoints. In fact, it always kind of did that. And again, that perspective is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's a totally valid and fine perspective to have. You know, I love my dudes. I love Mike McMahon. I love, you know, all the people that have worked on Star Trek. I love Terry Matalas. You know, it's a fine perspective. It's a perfectly valid way to write stuff and have a perspective on. But because that era of Star Trek was not inclusive, especially behind the scenes of more perspectives. I mean, Deep Space Nine, especially in its final season, I don't think it had any women writers, for example. I don't know about people of color, but certainly no women writers, and I don't think any out queer writers. And it means that Star Trek of that era really otherized, marginalized folks quite often in ways that furthered the marginalization stigmas of those groups, even if unintentionally. Like, for example, 7 of 9 in Star Trek Voyager always had to wear the sexy, like, skin-tight, boobs-out, tight uniform. Same thing with T'Pol in Star Trek Enterprise. Or you'd have, like, the Asian character and the black character in Star Trek Enterprise kind of being the more shunted off to the side ones in that series. Or queerness being seen as an alien metaphor. Quite often, not getting to see actual queer representation in modern, in Rick Berman era Star Trek, but just as like a metaphor. And so, to see people call out this season of Star Trek Picard as a return to Star Trek, and for me to see these sort of centralizing of the same viewpoint again of that era, especially when we look at like the way Deanna and Beverly have been sort of written as well, that I'll talk about in a different video, I'm sure, I think ignores the work that other Star Trek has done in this modern era to become much more inclusive in its perspective. Such as like with Star Trek Discovery, which I think with its amazing queer found family in that show, along with like its representation of people of color and many other groups, has felt much more inclusive in its storytelling rather than just being tokenistically diverse. But even like Strange New Worlds has this with bisexual characters and non-binary characters there getting to take part in the story. So in that context, I'm actually fine with Star Trek Picard existing within that context. But to hear people like call for it like this is a return to real Star Trek and it have these same issues and still having like queerness be marginalized. Like there's the only non-binary character in this season is the alien one that's the side character. I think they're great, but they're a side character. And we also see Seven and Raffi getting broken up after having finally come together in season 2.
I have gone into battle with lovers countless times. It can be therapeutic.
I'm not going.
That is a relief. I was practicing deceit.
Again, I don't think it's like, fuck bisexual women, but it is sort of like not giving that focused, and we instead get like stories a lot about mothers and even the queen kind of being the grotesque mother figure, the sort of like Eldra Torr mother figure. It starts to become problematic for me, and I can like sort of see the sort of narrative from certain spaces of the Star Trek fandom sort of like calling back to this nostalgic past of Star Trek that this feels like an evocation of. And it bothers me that this season is not refuting that in a way that is confronting the implicit biases that a lot of these people may have. Here's where we're going to sort of mix this metaphor again and frame and otherize queer people and other marginalized groups to a degree. Again, this is not calling people who work on Star Trek Picard transphobic, homophobic. It is criticizing an aspect of the show. I'm going to be honest. Sorry, this has been a long rant. I apologize. If I'm going to be honest, it kind of makes me nervous to say all of this. I'm sitting here and actually being like, I feel like these are valid concerns, and I'm worried about how it will be received, especially in the context of trans rights issues right now. You know, I worry about being the trans woman on the internet who's going to talk about Star Trek Picard and seem like the Debbie Downer, but expressing my concerns with the issue. And it's going to maybe make people vitriolic against me for stating my concern that I'm having in this episode. And I really don't want the Trek community, which is something that is very important to me, to echo the issues that I have been facing and seeing others face elsewhere. I want to have discussion. You know, I hope it's very clear that my enthusiasm for Star Trek, the enthusiasm for this season, and enthusiasm for a lot of the stuff in this season has been very clear. I love a lot of this. This is a critique of an aspect of the show and a couple other aspects of this season. I think this sort of ties into other things, again, like motherhood and how it's been depicted in this season that I can do a larger rant on. It's not a condemnation of the people on the show or fans of the show or of the whole show, because I love a lot of it. I think we can have discourse on aspects of things instead of like putting everything in the good or bad bucket. Nor is my belief that this is the writer's intent, but it is an implication that I think comes out of a lack of a diverse perspective. And it's just something to put out there for you all to think about. I'm here to make you think and provide my perspective, not to dictate to you what to feel or tell you you're wrong, or if the show is even good or bad. That's not, if you recognize, I don't say shows are good or bad. I talk about them. I offer my critique and analysis. However, I worry by expressing this that I'm going to get that flack from people who are going to see my viewpoint as like coming at them or attacking them. You know, whenever a trans or queer person brings up stuff in this way, people might think I'm being mean or overly critical. And it means that, you know, there's a part of me that's like, maybe I shouldn't express this at all. And I think that makes the work worse, and it doesn't make me an honest reviewer. And that feeling, too, is often why trans people and marginalized folks often don't feel comfortable speaking up about our perspective on something, because we're told to just sort of feed back the dominant group's narrative on something. And when we share our perspective, we're seen as overly sensitive or hyper worried, or our perspectives aren't listened to, or they're misunderstood, or worse, actively vilified. So I want to be clear. I love Star Trek. I love this season. Like I said, the D looks sexy as hell, and Shaw is perfection. I love the people who work on this season. I've spoken to them. You know, I got to meet Terry Metalis at the Star Trek Picard premiere. I thought he was a wonderful human being. And I think he's done really beautiful things with this season. But I want to be able to share my perspective and my analysis. I think it's necessary to do so. That's what Star Trek is about. That's why I love Star Trek, because it's a show that allows us to talk about these issues in a space that's accepting, and to not view the discussion as a conflict or condemnation, but a place for the conversation to create a greater understanding of ourselves, our community, and humanity generally. So there you go. That is my rant on the Borg in this season, and how this metaphor has been used. I offer it to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I realized that this was a very long rant, so I'm probably going to have split this rant off into a separate video, and then probably going to turn this into a script for a larger season-long review. So this has probably not been part of my main review, so go watch my main review if you want my thoughts there. And I wish you all, my friends, a live long and prosper.